Tidak, saya menganggap itu tidak besar.
Bagaimana mungkin tidak besar? 1 juta orang dibunuh atau lebih.
Itulah dia politik.
Jadi kepiye mak perasaan mama tinggal cerok di antara pembunuh anak mama? Kita nang lingkungannya kita, guru, kepala desa, itu termasuk orang yang ikut membunuh. Kalau orang sini, orang kampung sekitar Bapak, itu takut sama Bapak?
Orang tempat, itu orang tuh nggak tahu. Tapi orang tuh tahu. Kalau dia lawan macam saya, ini kata orang tempat cuma.
Kalau abangku itu orang yang dipotong juga.
Saya tanya Adi, abang awak itu jadi organisasi di Medan.
Pikir nggak usah, itulah.
Bilang karena ada lah gak apa-apa.
Kalau kita kaji dulu begini, kita ingin dulu. Wah, udah payah akan kejadian seperti dulu. Pasti akan kejadian.
Seandainya aku berbicara di era Orde Baru sama Bapak, apa yang akan Bapak lakukan dengan aku?
Gak bisa kita bayangkan ya.
Thank you. So if you have seen The Act of Killing, you will know that it's an amazing honor to have Joshua on this stage. It is an incredible film, and The Look of Silence as well is just as incredible, and they are companion pieces, right? I read that while in the early stages of filming, you realized that it was going to be 2 films. You wrote in your journal one night. How far into shooting were you, and where was your head at in terms of what you wanted to make for this story and aesthetically? You know, just the ideas that you had.
Well, I started making my work with, I started exploring the present-day legacy of the 1965-66 genocide with the main character in The Look of Silence, Adi Rukun, all the way back in 2003. And after we began that work, he would gather survivors to tell me their stories. And after 3 weeks, the army threatened all of them not to participate in the film. And he called me to a midnight meeting in his parents' home and said, "Don't give up, you're here, you speak the language. Finally, someone's here. Film the perpetrators." And that was terrifying to me at first, because I thought it would be dangerous. But when I overcame my fear and approached the perpetrators, I found that they were open and boastful in the worst and strangest and most surreal and horrifying way. And when Adi and the other survivors and then the whole Indonesian human rights community saw that material with the perpetrators, they said, "Keep filming the perpetrators." Anyone who hears how they're speaking will be forced to acknowledge that things are still terribly wrong today. And for the first 8 months, I filmed the perpetrators alone, one-on-one. And they were all boastful, one after another after another. But finally, I had to see what happens if I bring 2 together. I delayed doing that as long as possible because it was dangerous. One might tell the other, "Look, what is he doing? We shouldn't be talking this way," and get us all arrested. But I finally overcame that fear, brought 2 together, and filmed a scene that plays repeatedly throughout The Look of Silence, where 2 men take me to a riverbank where they helped kill 10,500 people, boasting about what they've done. And I realized when they were together, they were even worse. They were reading from a shared script. This boasting is impunity, and it's like wandering into Germany 40 years after the Holocaust, only to find the Nazis still in power. If the rest of the world, including the United States, celebrated and supported the Holocaust while it was taking place, that gave me this sense that I would stop everything I was doing and address this issue and make 2 films about impunity, not about what happened in 1965, but about what happens when killers win. One, the act of killing, about the lies and stories the perpetrators tell so they can live with themselves, and the terrible corrupting effects of that on the whole society. And the second, what is it like for ordinary human beings to have to live in such a society? What is it like for survivors to have to live surrounded by the powerful men who murdered their loved ones?
Now, just to give people a sense, the boasting that he's talking about is not just 2 men saying that they went to this place and killed people. They are graphically speaking and bragging about how they murdered these people, very, very graphically. Now, in making the second film, The Look of Silence, I don't think you would have gotten that aspect of what it's like for survivors to live within that corruption and that fear and that repression if you didn't have this footage of them watching them boast. Was that something that you knew you were going to be doing when it came to The Look of Silence, that would represent so much for you?
I think so, because it was, first of all, Adi, the main character in The Look of Silence, who sent me to film the perpetrators. He would watch everything I had time to show him for 7 years while I was filming the perpetrators and ultimately making the act of killing. And he would force me to look at it through his eyes, and he would refuse. I would want to reassure myself that these men have nothing to do with me, that these men are talking about monstrous things in monstrous ways, so they must be monsters. But Adi would insist upon seeing them as human beings, because of course he has to live with them. And it's impossible, it's impossibly terrifying to think you have to live surrounded by monsters. It's easy for us to say that from afar, but for him the only hope is if he's living with human beings, and that one day, for the sake of his children at least, there might be reconciliation. He would look at them as human beings, forcing me to look at them as human beings. And then, of course, in The Look of Silence, when he does this unprecedented thing of visiting perpetrators who still hold a monopoly on power and confronts them, something never before seen in Indonesia or even in the entire history of cinema. For him to go and do that and see them as human beings, they feel that they feel his humanity because he's looking at them as a human being. And they then feel the humanity of all the people they killed. And all of the lies justifying what they've done, that they've told themselves, come collapsing down. And they're forced to realize that his brother and all of the other victims were human. And that terrifies them. And they react with shame and guilt, fear of their own guilt, and then threats, anger, defensiveness, denial.
How far did any of those threats go for Adi?
Well, 2 of the most powerful perpetrators threaten, if you continue to look into this, it will. If you continue to look into this, it will happen again. We will do this again. One of them goads him on, saying, continue with this secret communist activity. The victims were accused of being communists, and that was used to justify their murders. So he's essentially saying, we could kill you too. Because I had shot the act of killing, but it had never yet screened by the time I went and filmed The Look of Silence, I was well known across the region for being close to some of the most powerful men in Indonesia and some of the most powerful perpetrators in Indonesia. And the men Adi wanted to confront were regionally powerful, but not nationally powerful. And we realized...
Was that because these were the men who were most likely linked to the death of his brother?
That's right. He was from a rural area, and the men who, even the highest-ranking men who were involved with killing his brother were not national figures. But because I'd worked with nationally powerful politicians, the vice president of the country, cabinet ministers, members of parliament, the governor of the province, and because the film I'd made with them, The Act of Killing, had not yet screened, no one had seen it, people believed I was still close to them. And that offered us this protection because the perpetrators Adi would meet would be reluctant to detain us, let alone physically attack us, because they wouldn't want to offend, they wouldn't want to risk offending their superiors.
Would they be reluctant to talk to him alone about these issues as well without you there?
I think if I wasn't there, it would have been truly dangerous for Adi. They might have spoken to him, but I'm not sure he would have gotten through some of the confrontations alive. because I was there, I was able to bring him and say, look, I'm back after all of these years. You know that I filmed you years ago. In the meantime, you know I went on to make a film with, and I would name some very powerful people to remind them of our connections as a safety precaution. You know, this time I'm back, I don't want you to dramatize what you've done, which is what they did in the act of killing. Instead, I've brought a friend who has a personal relationship to these killings. I want to see how you discuss it. I want to see, if you disagree, I want to see how you disagree. Try to listen to one another. Don't be afraid of disagreement. Because Adi, I would say that because Adi was hoping for dialogue, for reconciliation with his neighbors. And although I thought it was very unlikely to occur, I wanted to encourage it. So I would say this, and I would say, and also Adi's an optometrist, and I would say, as a thank you for your time, and Adi's an optometrist, he will perform an eye test on you if you want, and if you need glasses, we will give you as many glasses as you like. And so these extraordinary confrontations would begin, which could never have happened otherwise, where Adi is testing the eyes of the men who murdered his brother, and then asking them to take responsibility for what they've done.
Asking them to see the past, asking them to look at the past. I mean, this is something that I've been wanting to talk to you about, which is your approach to storytelling is you don't see metaphor and irony approached in storytelling in most fiction films the way that you do it. It's unprecedented for a documentary to sort of have a grasp and a control on metaphor and irony the way that you do. Does this come when you set out to make these films? Did you get in with this with Adi and know, like, okay, he's going to be testing these eye devices on them. This is clearly ironic, considering we are trying to force these men to look at something.
Yeah, I anticipate as a filmmaker, and it's I see my filmmaking not as storytelling. I see it as, I don't go out with a sense of the story I want to tell. I see it as an exploration. I'm taking a journey with my collaborators, with my participants into the unknown, but I'm guided by a vision. And so, of course, when I understand Adi is an optometrist, and I realize that actually if Adi's testing the eyes of the men we're visiting, that serves two functions. First of all, it makes the scene, the confrontation safer, because when you're in a doctor's office, an optometrist's office, you're disarmed, your guard is down, you're not likely to get physically violent. And also Adi could prolong the test for as long as necessary until the perpetrator had the chance to volunteer for Adi all of the important details that he'd told me years earlier. And therefore Adi would not have to go to them and say, well, you said this and this and this to Joshua, which would make the scene immediately confrontational. But of course I also understood this would be this powerful metaphor for blindness. And because here's a man who is, as you put it, is trying to help people see who are willfully blind. And then when you have a sense like that as a filmmaker, you treat that idea, that inspiration, like a seedling in a garden, and a very delicate one, and you plant it, you try and find fertile soil for it, just the right scene for it, just the right moment for it. You provide it with water and fresh air, and not too much, protected from too much sun and wind, and you grow the metaphor slowly and organically as you shoot, and produce images where it arises naturally and organically, but really takes on a life and a mystery of its own. And that's what I try to do with all of the images in my films.
How difficult is it to maintain that patience, to maintain that anticipation, and that sort of broad view of what the story can be when you are focusing on something that is so tragic, so direct, so instant, or could be so instant for an audience?
Well, I think it is that tragedy. It is the importance of what I feel I'm dealing with that motivates me to do that. It's the sense that, it takes a long time, it's difficult, it's uncertain, but you feel you're doing it for a very important reason. You're trying. See, I think if I made a journalistic film where I go and I expose the horrific political situation in Indonesia under which people are living.
But in many ways you have.
Yes, but if I did it through a kind of journalistic exposition where the viewer is listening to an explanation and is feeling it, has the same distance from the events that the narrator would have, the viewer would be looking through a window at a far-off reality that they care little about. My task is to try to immerse you in that reality, to make that reality your reality, so that first of all you feel all of the pain and mystery and sorrow that one family experiences, so that paradoxically, by going smaller, by being microscopic, the film becomes bigger, it becomes universal. And then you also see this film not just as a story about something far away. You recognize yourself in it. It becomes a mirror in which we recognize our own humanity and these same issues about our failure to face the past right here at home. Not only is the Indonesian genocide our past, because it's in part the work of our government, our elected officials, but also we have more proximate traumas. I mean, it's very moving to be releasing this film at the end of a year where there's been reminder after reminder, traumatic and important reminder after traumatic and important reminder about the open wound of race in this country and how it's not receding into the past until we address it.
It's interesting that you brought up race, because when I was watching the film, and I think when I was reading an interview with you this morning, I had the thought that I would love to see what Joshua Oppenheimer would do in discussing race in this country. If he was to do something historical about the civil rights movement or about slavery, how you would focus on that. I'm sure you don't have an idea right now as to how you would, but it seemed like it'd be fascinating to see you pinpoint your particular skills and your masterful storytelling on American history in some capacity.
But it's actually a great idea. I mean,
you're welcome.
It's a great, thank you. It's a great idea.
So with this film, with Adi, you have him going around, you have him testing the lenses. At the end of the film, I don't want to give anything away. I also don't think this is the type of movie where we say spoiler alert or anything. But you do have a family who says at one point, I believe, let's all learn to love, or let's all love each other and be good to each other like the dictatorship taught us. That's an incredible piece of dialogue spoken by someone who's clearly willfully blinded, as you said, right?
Yeah, I mean, you hear again and again throughout the film, let the past be past. And survivors always say it out of fear. And perpetrators always say it as a threat. So the line, the statement, belies itself. It reveals that it's not true, in the sense that it is the past right there, present, open, gaping, that's keeping the survivors afraid. And it is the past that's empowering the perpetrators to threaten, that's being wielded as a weapon. And in that scene with it's two brothers whom Adi confronts, the widow and two sons of a perpetrator. And it was an amazing scene, because I'd actually worked with those two sons and with the widow when the husband was still alive for 3 months to dramatize what the father had done. So it never occurred to me that they would deny knowing what the father had done, which is what happens when Adi goes and visits them.
Well, you show footage of her standing next to him while he's talking about what he had done.
That's right, because I never thought they would pretend they didn't know, because I would know they're lying. The whole idea there was Adi would go and say, look, you know who I am, I know who you are, because they're from the same village, they're virtually neighbors. It's not your fault what your father did, and we have to live together. One day, what if my daughter wanted to marry one of your sons or your grandson? It would be a tragedy if we couldn't come together for them and be a family. We have to live together. And because they knew him, they panicked and pretended they didn't know anything. And I'm pushing them to watch this old footage, as you say, shoving the laptop in their face, not out of anger, not to humiliate them, not to punish them, but simply to get past this absurd denial. And we failed. And I felt, as I left that scene, shooting that scene, I felt that we missed this really, that we'd gone to build bridges, not to burn them. But then as I looked at the footage, I saw that, and I felt very badly about it. But
why did you feel bad? That you had humiliated them for no
I'd
purpose?
upset the mother. I'd upset the two sons. They say at the end of the scene, we used to like you, Joshua. We don't anymore. But then when I looked at the material, and we'd failed to get the dialogue that Adi wanted with his neighbors. In fact, we'd made the situation between him and his neighbors, his most proximate neighbors, worse. And yet when I looked at the material, I realized this material makes it impossible to ignore. It makes visible this previously invisible abyss of fear and guilt, and for the perpetrators and their relatives, fear of guilt, that divides every Indonesian from their neighbors, sometimes even members of the same family, which we see in the film. And that if we can show this in the film, if we end the film in this way, it will be impossible for anybody seeing the film not to support truth, reconciliation, and justice, even if they come from perpetrators' families. And in this way, I hope we will succeed in a bigger way through the film where we might fail in the individual confrontations.
And now the film has been incredibly successful in Indonesia, or at least the act of killing was, right? In terms of opening people's eyes and creating a new kind of dialogue.
Well, The Look of Silence has been more successful. I mean, the act of killing helped catalyze a fundamental transformation in how the mainstream media and therefore the broader public are talking about the past. Before, with very few exceptions, there was either silence or the celebration of the heroic extermination of the Indonesian left. Now the media talks about a genocide as a genocide. They talk about the terrible regime that the perpetrators have built. And into this, the act of killing screened thousands of times. It prompted the government, when it was nominated for an Academy Award, it prompted the government to acknowledge that what happened in 1965 was a crime against humanity and that there should be truth and reconciliation. Then into that space came The Look of Silence. Unlike the act of killing, which began its life in Indonesia in secret, it's distributed by two government bodies, the National Human Rights Commission and the Jakarta Arts Council, something unimaginable with the act of killing. The first screening was held in Indonesia's largest theater. There were billboards announcing it. It was a venue for 1,500 people. 3,000 people came. They had to put on a second screening so everyone could see the film. Adi came as a surprise guest to both screenings and received a 15-minute standing ovation after each. It was National Heroes Day and trending on Twitter around the world, because Indonesia is the largest Twitter-using country in the world. Trending on Twitter around the world was, we have a new national hero today, and his name is Adi Rukun. Into that space then came now 3,500 public screenings of the film. We estimate about 300,000 people have seen the film, and soon the film will be online for free for tens of millions of people to see.
Do you think that, or let me ask this a different way, the act of killing, was it strategic to release that first, in the sense that setting up the dialogue with act of killing would open up a safer space to then have Adi as a hero? If you had released The Look of Silence first, it would have been released like the act of killing, kind of secretly, and Adi would have been possibly in much more danger, right?
Adi would have had to evacuate to Europe, which is where I'm based, if we had released The Look of Silence first. I think the act of killing created the space in which Adi can now do the very important work that he's been doing for the last 8 months of traveling with the film and being a spokesperson and a model, a spokesperson for the cause of truth and reconciliation, and a model for what the dialogue of truth and reconciliation ought to look like. The empathy, the mutual recognition from both sides of the other side's humanity. It doesn't matter which film you see first here in the United States, but I feel like that The Look of Silence, together with the uncut act of killing, what was released in the United States and on Netflix as the director's cut of the act of killing, together I hope form a single work whose whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Was it something that you knew was strategic for the safety of Adi when you released the act of killing first, or was it more because the act of killing was done first?
Well, it was in part that. I mean, it took 7 to 8 years to make the act of killing, which was much longer than any of the funders expected, and it would have been hard to get them to agree to let us make a whole other film and release that and hold back the first one. But also in Indonesian, the titles of the films are shorter. The act of killing is just slaughter or butcher. It's one word, jagal, and The Look of Silence is just one word, senyap, or silence. And it reflects, I think, the impact of the film in Indonesia reflects the sequence of what happened in Indonesia. First there was slaughter, and then there was silence. And somehow the Look of Silence, it has come, the two films have come like the child in The Emperor's New Clothes, and there's a logic to the order in which they come. The first one comes and says, look at this horrific regime that we're all living under, but which we're too afraid to acknowledge. And into that space, that opens the way for activism, because now people can address the problem. You can't address a problem that you're too afraid to talk about. Into that space comes the second film, also like the child in The Emperor's New Clothes, and says, now look at how torn our society is. Look how afraid we are of each other. making people realize and fear, well, feel this society is supposed to be a democracy, but you can't have a democracy without community, and you can't have community when everyone's afraid of each other.
Absolutely. I want to ask you a question about how you shoot your films, because a lot of times they don't feel like documentaries. It feels like you've set up a scene, you've lit it a little bit. I mean, how do you go into shooting some of these scenes, particularly this one right here? As I was watching it, I started being like, okay, it seems like he has a number of angles going on here while he's shooting the scene, and all of them seem to be on tripods. It's not like a regular documentary where you're just trying to capture everything that's happening as fast as possible. That's what a lot of them feel like. This feels like you've really set the stage for something.
Well, that's right. I see nonfiction filmmaking as working together with the participants to create occasions within the overall safe space of making a film where everybody is somehow pushed a little bit beyond their comfort zone or a lot beyond their comfort zone. And the most important contradictions, the most important problems, the things that people don't want to look at but are vitally important come to the surface. So in the example of this scene, you can remember, as I was explaining, the way I introduced it to the participants was, now I'm here with Adi, I want to document this conversation between you, and he will test your eyes as a gesture of our gratitude. And that, of course, gives me the freedom to then set up as I need to and put one camera here and one camera there. And the reason I use two cameras is because I understood what I'm really documenting here are the reactions. We're not likely to get the forgiveness, the apology that Adi's seeking. We're likely to get shame and panic and guilt and then defensiveness and threats and anger. But if I can capture those ultimately human and understandable reactions, because we all know what it's like to be defensive after we feel guilty. If I can capture that, then anybody seeing the film will be forced to acknowledge how torn the society is, this abyss that's dividing people. And so that does require focusing not on the words, but on the reactions. And for that, I use two cameras, and I direct the scene. I introduce the scene in such a way where there's the space for that. The scene is not staged, but I'm creating a stage for this occasion, which would never happen otherwise. It would be, people see the film and think, oh, I'm following an optometrist as he goes and tests the eyes of the perpetrators who killed his brother, and yet we've seen that he's studying footage I shot of them earlier. So of course, I'm not just following him into their homes. I'm introducing Adi, the optometrist, to the perpetrator, and that gives me the space to set the scene and film it with as much precision as I feel a topic this serious, this important, this human deserves.
Did you ever come across a perpetrator who had no visual recognition of any shame, of any guilt, who really just gave you nothing? Maybe they may have talked about it a little bit, but there was nothing coming from them?
No, because if they did, they would be impervious to Adi's questions. They would think, well, no, it was right, it was right, it was right. Their anger betrays their shame.
Well, and also what we know as wrong.
And they're boasting. I mean, every perpetrator I've met, I believe, was incited by the government, by the military, to betray their individual morality and join a group that they knew was doing something wrong. And we all know what this is like. I mean, all of us have joined groups that are doing something that we feel slightly uncomfortable with, at least, and we think, well, if the group is doing it, it's probably okay. But when you do something this wrong, then you live your life in perpetual flight from a pall of guilt and shame that follows you everywhere you go. And because these men haven't been removed from power, they still have available to them a victor's history justifying what they've done. So they do the human thing. They try to take these rotten, bitter memories that are so hard to swallow and sugarcoat them with the sweet language of this victor's history, celebrating what they've done. And that, of course, accounts for why the perpetrators are always boasting about the most unseemly details, the most grisly details, things we can't believe that they would boast about.
Now, you mentioned at the top of this interview that it's for Adi, he has to approach these as people who committed horrible acts, not necessarily horrible people that were committing horrible acts. And that was a little bit difficult for you. You felt a bit differently. Did you come to Adi's side of that argument by the end of making these two films? Do you feel that you were talking to people who committed horrible acts, or do you believe that there are just horrible people?
No, I think that Primo Levi said this very beautifully. There may be monsters among us, but they're too few to worry about. what we really have to worry about, and he was talking about perpetrators of the Holocaust, what we really have to worry about are the ordinary people like us.
And there was something that you said in an interview that I wanted to ask you about, which was called, it was just a phrase that I loved, which was the tragedy of escapism, I heard you say. Can you talk about that a little bit and how your film reflects either a fear of the tragedy of escapism or how it sort of confronts it?
Yeah, I think that somehow The Look of Silence and The Act of Killing are works about the tragedy of the lies, the stories, the fantasies, the self-deception that the perpetrators have told themselves and imposed on the whole society. And in The Look of Silence, we see what it feels like to have that imposed on you as someone whose loved ones have been killed. People sometimes say about my films, oh, they pull back the curtain to reveal this nightmare that no one knew about, as though what they're really doing is just exposing this genocide that people hadn't heard of, and that's what makes them interesting. Well, there's many atrocities that we have heard about, but that we don't care about. So just exposing another one would be of little interest to most people. The reason these films are interesting, the reason they've had an impact in Indonesia, is because they reveal that the curtain itself is the nightmare. It forces people to live a lie. It divides us from, and we all know what that's like, living a lie. We all know what it's like not being able to look at the most important aspects of our world. It means that we have one chance to live in this world. We have one shot at living. And what a tragedy to go through life lying to ourselves and with our eyes closed.
Absolutely. I think we have some time for questions. Does anybody have any questions out here in the audience? We have one right here.
A few months ago, there was a lot in the news about the Bali Nine and Indonesia's execution of foreigners who were accused of smuggling in drugs. What do you make of that? And do you feel like that policy connects somehow to Indonesia's violent past?
Yes, it does. Indonesia has a law which says that drug traffickers can be put to death. Under the last president, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who was in power until last autumn, no one had been executed for, including the Bali Nine, for trafficking drugs. The current president came to power through a promise of being different. He's the first Indonesian president not to be connected and to have enriched himself and risen to power and prominence through the military dictatorship. So there was a hope. He was sort of seen like Indonesia's Obama. And yet he was subject to tremendous pressure from war criminals, from mass murderers, including his main opponent. And he was called weak. He was called a servant of the West and someone who's pandering to to Western opinion. Whereas, in fact, it was the war criminal opponent, Prabowo, who was closely aligned with the U.S. government throughout his tenure in the U.S. in the Indonesian army. And I think that I supported Jokowi, that's the new president, in his bid for the presidency because he was the only candidate who had not committed the act of killing. And he committed it by having those people executed, a violation of international law. He's now committed the act of killing, and he's done it precisely to pander to the military, the remnants of the military dictatorship, the oligarchs, the thugs, who constitute this kind of violent shadow state that my first film, The Act of Killing, exposes. And the tragedy is that months later, when he could have said, okay, that was wrong, he was condemned, I think, in part by his own conscience, by his own knowledge, which I believe he has, that what he did was wrong, to repeat it. Because if he refused to kill the second batch of prisoners, it's tantamount to admitting it was wrong the first time. And then he has to spend the rest of his life, whatever power and public image he has, looking in the mirror and thinking of himself as a murderer. And the tragedy here, of course, is that this shows that you can't just divide the human being. Not only can you not divide the world into good guys and bad guys, you can't divide the human soul into good parts and bad parts. What I'm saying here, what led him, his fear of guilt that led him to kill the second batch of prisoners, is his morality. It is his distinct discernment between the difference between right and wrong. And that's a part of the mechanism of evil. So it's as though the angel on one shoulder is part of the devil on the other.
And it's why the killings that you're talking about in these two films went on for so long, because they were justified, you would say, or kind of what you just said, they were justified by sort of the killings that happened just before them.
Exactly. Just as the men in my films are obligated to boast to avoid confronting their own guilt, if you've been told to kill one, if you've been incited to kill one person, and then the army, and you feel terrible about it, but the army's telling you it was heroic, it was good, don't worry, that makes you feel better. But at night, you're still having nightmares. And then the next week, they come back and say, now kill 50 people for the same reason. Again, if you refuse, it's equivalent to admitting it was wrong the first time. And many people, I think, will then continue into that downward spiral of depravity and moral corruption.
Right. Next question.
Hi, you mentioned race relations. Is there any other subject that you're interested in? And what is your next project?
I'm not going to tell you much about my next project. There's so much that interests me. One of the executive producers of this film, of The Look of Silence, both films, Werner Herzog, when he found out I was making a second film dealing with the genocide, he said, Joshua, you really should consider making an Eddie Murphy comedy.
Werner Herzog said that to you?
Yes, and he just made like a 4-hour, or 5, I can't remember how long it is, how many episodes, but a series of films about death row. And I retorted, are you making an Eddie Murphy comedy next, Werner? Because I understood that his work was also giving him nightmares.
Does your work give you nightmares?
It did. There's a scene in the so-called director's cut of The Act of Killing, which was, for me, the straw that broke the camel's back. It's a scene where Anwar Congo, the main character, starts to recognize that he can't run away from his guilt, that he'll never get beyond it, and he despairingly, cynically throws himself into embracing the worst of what he's done, and tries to sort of make it palatable to himself by playing a kind of glamorous, evil film noir anti-hero. It's a scene where he butchers a teddy bear. It starts out as a game, but it's one of the most awful things I've ever seen, and one of the most important scenes in the film. And it's a pity that it's not in the shorter American theatrical cut. But when I watched that, he had to stop me and say, Joshua, you're crying. And I put my hands to my face, realized I was crying, and he said, what should we do? Should we stop? And I said, no, we must continue. And I think I should have stopped that night, because it was maybe just the straw that broke the camel's back, but I had 8 months of nightmares and insomnia after that. The Look of Silence, lest that should deter you from seeing it, The Look of Silence was maybe physically frightening to make, but it was emotionally healing.
You had 8 months of nightmares?
Yeah.
Wow. Do we have another question out here?
Hi. I watched an interview with you earlier today where you were talking about kind of the role of silences in your films and in filmmaking in particular. And I was wondering if you thought that as a filmmaker, film as a medium is kind of uniquely able to explore these sorts of kind of existential tragedies, genocides, in the light that you couldn't in other mediums, per se.
That's a really beautiful and interesting point, because I think I've said something along what you heard me say probably earlier was something along the lines that that cinema is a poor medium for words. It's a great medium for doubt, for hesitation, for fear, for silence, shame, embarrassment, and to also show how the space in which we live is haunted, which is, I think, part of why I take such care in crafting the images. I'm taking everyday landscapes and trying to make them resplendent with the swarm of ghosts of the dead that can never be buried, and whose deaths, in fact, were never even mourned because their loved ones weren't told that their relatives had been killed. And so if cinema is a poor medium for words, I also would say, what you're saying is that words are a poor medium for addressing the unspeakable. So maybe cinema does offer us new ways of imagining our way out from things that really should be unimaginable.
Well, I think some would say that you've imagined a new way for cinema.
I've just tried to be as precise as I can.
Do you have any more questions? I don't think so. Joshua, congratulations. Oh, do we have one more? Did you just notice someone? Okay, sorry.
I was Just curious with the interviews that Adi did with the killers. How much were you involved with sculpting his dialogue in those interviews?
First of all, I would say they're very much not interviews. An interview is sort of like what we're doing here. I'm giving information. I'm being asked for information, for feelings. Adi's trying to talk about something that people have been too afraid to talk about to make peace with his neighbors, and that fails miserably, except for one daughter who finds the courage to apologize. That's a confrontation. It's a scene. It's a dramatic moment, and therefore it was difficult to sort of, the way you might stop something and say, well, maybe we should ask about that. It wasn't about that. It was about following the emotional journey. So what we would do is Adi would watch the footage that I'd shot as a kind of preparation, so he would understand what kind of man this is, where the contradictions are, where he might ask them about what he might start to ask the man to take responsibility for what he's done. And then we would, and then it was always up to Adi completely whether he would reveal who his brother was, that he was a victim's brother or not. It was always his choice, because it was a matter of safety. But what would often happen, and where all of the confrontations, except for the one with the daughter, end where she apologizes, all of them end with an impasse. And sometimes that impasse would happen very quickly. And then I would have to cut, and I would have to talk to Adi about ways we might get beyond the impasse, or talk to the perpetrator and say, try to just listen, try to open your mind here. And that would also serve to calm down the situation and get rid of dispel danger. I would do that if I had to say something to Adi. Usually I couldn't say it out loud, so I would whisper to him, so the perpetrator wouldn't feel ganged up upon, or I would then have to make up some inane direction to whisper to the perpetrator. And so I would stop to direct to keep the occasion going. I talked about creating these occasions, to keep the occasion going for as long as possible until it was clear we couldn't get any further.
How did you find getting this information, having these occasions, these conversations, that you had to adapt to the culture to understand how to make them possible? Where did you see any blockers in terms of how Westerners communicate versus how the East communicates?
Well, it was very helpful for me that I was really immersed in the place for many years that I'd lived. By the time we shot this film, I'd been working in Indonesia for 11 years. I was fluent in the language. And I also have a wonderful Indonesian crew. These are people who at the end of the film, a kind of finale of the film, the kind of final punch of the film is that they're all credited as anonymous. These are people who gave 10 years of their lives, some of them changing their careers from human rights lawyers, heads of NGOs, university professors, journalists, taking initially a 6-month sabbatical and discovering this would take a decade, risking their safety to make this work, knowing that it would be impossible for them to take credit for what they'd done until there's real change. Well, one of them, someone who's like a brother to me now, I suppose, was my production manager and my assistant director, but also my main creative sounding board about what we might or might not do, what would be going too far, what would be acceptable, how we could get out safely. And I think that dialogue that was so important to how we were able to do this, and also in crafting the film to making a film that's fluent in Indonesian culture. Because of course, if cinema is about body language, I think all body language is more or less legible across cultures for the most part. But if it's about subtext and body language, you have to know, you have to be really fluent. And I think that dialogue was so important that I, in the end, credited him as a co-director on the film, because the film would not be making the impact it's making if it had a stranger's eye view. It wouldn't make that impact inside Indonesia if people thought it was a film for foreigners. It would just make people self-conscious. The fact that it's seen as an authentic work of Indonesian cinema makes it a mirror in which Indonesians are forced to see themselves. They don't have the shock of the new, they have the shock of the familiar. Oh no, is that really us? And I think that it's the same authenticity that makes the film impactful here. You're not seeing the film as a kind of exposition, explanation of another place. you're seeing a work about humanity, and everyone in the film is recognizable. Adi, the main character, could be you or your brother, his parents or your grandparents, his children, your children, and it becomes universal. And that wouldn't happen also if it wasn't fluent.
Absolutely. I think we have to wrap it up. Joshua, thank you so much for being here. Congratulations on 2 remarkable, remarkable films. Go see The Look of Silence. If you have not seen The Act of Killing, I think both the theatrical and the director's cut are on Netflix. I think we would recommend the director's cut to watch, though, right? Check out The Act of Killing and go see The Look of Silence this weekend. Guys, thank you so much for being here.